Hello, and welcome to this Living with Machines book launch, a happy event. I'm one half of your co-host today. I'm James Smithies. I'm Professor of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and I'm co-hosting with Jane Winters, who's Professor of Digital Humanities at the School of Advanced Studies, University of London. And I'm here with two of the authors. The book title, as you'll all know, is Collaborative Historical Research in the Age of Big Data, Lessons from an Interdisciplinary Project. Authors are Ruth Ahnert, Professor of Literary History and Digital Humanities at Queen Mary University of London and Principal Investigator on the Living with Machines project here at the Turing Institute, and Emma Griffin, Professor of Modern History at the UEA, also President of the Royal Historical Society and co-investigator on Living with Machines. And unfortunately not with us today, two more co-authors, Mia Ridge, British Library's Digital Curator for Western Heritage Collections and a co-investigator on the project, and Giorgia Tolfo was Data and Content Manager at the British Library and is about to start a new job at the National Archives. So the format for today is a fireside chat. It'll be a relaxed conversation between the four of us, followed by some questions from Zoom. So I thought Jane and I will kick off with a few highlights from the book, from our perspective, but really this is about hearing from the authors, from Ruth and Emma. From my perspective, the book is exceptionally important as part of a growing genre of digital humanities work that's crucial for development of the field. It acknowledges the value of tacit knowledge across all aspects of project design, development and administration. And while in the book you mentioned that some of these topics sound like banal administrivia, which I thought was a great word, it's true that these sorts of frameworks are really important to ensure that being radical does not lead to other power structures emerging in unforeseen ways. So it's incredibly important work. But I think that the book also, to be a bit provocative, I think it justifies the Living with Machines funding in and of itself as an experiment in collaborative research across radically different research domains and technological practices. And finally, my last thought is I was taken by the honesty of the book. This sort of work doesn't work unless you're fully open and transparent about the problems and as well as the opportunities that you encountered in the project. And you do that beautifully.
This is a wonderful book, which I encourage everybody to read. And I know James and I were asked to pick sort of 3 things each, and all of us struggled to get a list below 10. There was so much to take away. But James finished with honesty, and I think I would like to partner that with generosity, the generosity that's motivated and runs through this book. And it's not just about making Living with Machines the best project it could be. It's about helping other projects working in this field to do as well as they can and to lift the whole field up, I think. I was also really struck in places by the real manifesto quality to it. You talk at one point about an uncompromisingly collaborative research philosophy, and there are other places that really do feel like important calls to arms for lots of different stakeholders, for funding bodies, for researchers, for cultural heritage institutions. There's a lot there for people to take away and really act on in their work. And then I think it's about the importance of establishing shared values in a project, a big project of this kind that brings in people from lots of different sectors and disciplines, making those explicit and also not setting them in stone. You talk about living documentation all the way through and going back and checking, is this still working for us? How do we need to change it? What might we need to do differently? And that, I think, has led to the delivery of an extremely successful project. And as I said, a wonderful book that's going to help others do the same.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So now we've got some questions to direct at Ruth and Emma. I think, Jane, you were going to start.
I will start off, and it's the obvious question really, but I genuinely want to know, how did you go about writing the book? And there's things there about carving out the time to do this during a really large, intensive research project, and thinking about the format and all of that, and I would really love to hear how that worked. And perhaps, Ruth, if you wanted to start.
Great, thanks for the question. We're really lucky that Jane and James have been on our advisory board, and there was a point early on in one of the meetings where they said it'd be really good if you produced a handbook of the things you've learned from the project. So we took this to heart and we thought, do we get someone to come in and look at us, or do we write it ourselves? So we started sort of about a year into a project doing reflection processes at the end of each work iteration. We have sort of 3-month work iterations. And we would sit down after that and reflect on what was working. And so Giorgia and I led those sessions. There'd be kind of guided writing sessions where we'd ask a set of questions and people would then just write their responses. And actually, we generated loads and loads of material, but it was kind of a bit of a confessional. So we then sat down to think about actually how can we turn this kind of confessional literature into something that's useful for the community. And so we started writing a structure and bullet points and like putting in some of this material. But it was gradually we decided we needed to think about where we were going to publish it, and then we approached Cambridge Elements, and so the format then became clearer, and Emma and Mia came on board and we started these regular writing sessions doing half a day a week and just chipping away at it, and it evolved over time through our 4 voices. Would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, it was for me, it was a really novel way of writing and working, because as a historian, I've written everything I've ever done has really been written on my own. So it's just, nothing happens unless you sit there and develop the document. And we did do these Wednesday morning writing sessions, and it's so different because you see other people. We had a Google Doc, so you see other people actually working at the same time as you, and if you're not doing things, that document might actually improve and it might kind of go places even when you're not doing anything. So it's a kind of very joyful part of the process, but it was also just really interesting. We would kind of start the Wednesday morning with a check-in, and we'd just chat to each other about the different things that we were going to do, it was just really enjoyable, just talking through what we wanted to achieve. So some of those little knots that you look at a document on your own and you're like, oh, how am I going to solve this? And it's very hard to move forward. You kind of talk that through, and then you do the writing. And it was a kind of a mix of sociability and thinking time. So for me, it was a very novel process and a very enjoyable one.
It's great to hear about joyfulness in writing, and I think that really comes through in the book as well. But I'll hand over to James.
I've got a question about training versus collaboration. For Emma, maybe to start.
Yeah.
How did you balance the need in the project? So this is getting to the project itself. How did you balance the need to train people with new skills with a radically interdisciplinary team with the simple need to just get on with collaboration? I mean, you refer to this in the book, and it suggests that it was sort of a perennial problem throughout the project because that radical interdisciplinarity was never going to go away. But presumably you found a balance at some point?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So when we were working on the handbook, it was very obvious that I would put my hand up and say, yes, I'll do this, because that's what I do. I do writing. It's kind of my bread and butter. But there are so many other things that are going on in the project that I don't naturally do. And I'm working with lots of other people who do naturally do some of those things and don't do the other one. So there is that, there's just a really big question as to who does what, and how do the people who aren't doing that understand and keep abreast of what those people who are doing it are actually doing it. And there are different approaches. So, I mean, there's certainly some skilling up. All of us skilled up a little bit, and we spent a long time in the first year, those of us who've never used Python, having Python training sessions so we could learn a little bit about programming. Those people who didn't have humanities backgrounds, we had a reading group, so we would talk and discuss essays, and so we would do the things that we're familiar with. And then, I guess after that first year, people developed according to their taste and their interest. So some people then kind of went back into their shells a little bit, and some people carried on developing their skills. And if, for those people who were kind of keeping a little bit more within their domain, that meant you had to collaborate, basically. You didn't learn somebody else's skills, because you do realise at some point you're not going to learn all of the skills, and there's no need for everybody to learn all of the skills, but you do need to kind of communicate and collaborate with those other people. So it was really a mix. It was very much on the temperament and the skills that people had, with lots of training up and lots of collaboration. Where you can't train, you collaborate and you talk.
It almost sounds like the training was sort of an icebreaker for collaboration as well, where you'd sort of get started and then get to a point where you just had to
Yeah,
go
no,
on.
absolutely. It's like going back to school in some ways, and being in a classroom and like somebody's teaching you a new skill. Yeah, it was really novel.
And we in the book, we talk about Peter Gallison's idea of trading zones. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it, because some of us felt like we were learning just enough language of this other discipline to ask questions in the right way, to have conversations. It was kind of like our conversational French. Just sort of building that ability to know that we're asking the same question. So that was really important. I think there's also this sense in which it allowed us to do something a bit different from, I mean, we can acquire more skills, but we're only going to get so far when we've got loads of domains to cover. But when you bring together domain experts from across fields, you can really push a cutting edge. So sometimes we're using things from off the shelf, like that. Sometimes Zooniverse is the answer, sometimes Kepler is the answer, sometimes Inception is the tool we want to use. But sometimes we're like, there is a gap here and we need to develop an entirely new methodology or an entirely new tool. And you can't do that unless you have kind of people who are those domain experts. And then it's this iterative process of explaining from the historian's perspective what you would need that methodology to achieve. Someone kind of coming up with a working minimal viable product, and then you're saying, well, it's working so far, but we need to fine tune it in this way. And it has to be this kind of iterative process. And we've got some great examples of that on the project. We've got a new tool we developed called Map Reader. We're like, how can we search historical maps? So we developed a computer vision pipeline so that some historians could sit down and annotate, or actually anyone, we were all doing, weren't we? We were kind of carving up maps and saying, is there rail in this box or not? And then we would annotate it, and then we would train the computer vision pipeline on it, and then it would make predictions, and then we had to sort of fine tune it. And that's been great because it's met a historical need, but actually it's also met a general need in other fields, because we've already found that biologists want to use it because on phenotype maps, because it can also be trained on those. So anyone with visual data can use it. So that's an example of us kind of collaborating and creating something that's sort of greater than the sum other parts. But I kind of want to get at what Emma was saying, that actually this is all like additional labour. It sounds like, oh, great, we've got loads of people from different areas. We can just carve up the task and it will take much less time. But all of that labour needed to create understanding in the first place, so that we're even speaking the same language. Then we need to think about actually what do we need? And how does it speak back to our home disciplines? So we create something that's greater than the sum of the parts. It's taken us ages to get there because we've acquired all these skills to have the conversation, to create the thing. And then we think, now we need to acquire the skills to communicate that back to those communities. So it creates a lot of extra work, but we hope that it does indeed create something greater than the sum other parts.
Yeah, Ruth, just as you were speaking, I just wanted to say, I forgot to say something. It was really hard. That was the bit I missed out. It's really hard, whether you're skilling up or whether you're trying to deal with other people's skills and communicate. It is really hard and really labour intensive. And I think that you can't talk about it without being honest about that. It's time consuming.
Really difficult for planning purposes as well. How do you scope that time and put it against a budget when really it's a piece of string to some degree, isn't it? You need to have that freedom to be able to sort of follow the creative and intellectual journey. Yeah.
I mean, we kind of tried to work in an agile way, but one of the things we decided to do very early on is to come up with a way of getting somewhere in a short space of time. So we wanted to be somewhere at the end of the first year. So we came up with this idea because James Hetherington, who was one of the co-Is at the beginning of the project, he said, well, in industry we have a minimal viable product, so why don't we adapt that idea for the project? So what would a minimum research outcome look like for each of the labs that we started in? So we sat down and did a design documents for each of the labs saying, okay, what would a minimum research outcome for each of those be? So that allowed us to be more playful and iterative in that process, and ideally have something minimal at the end of the year, but also be able to say, do you know what, that experiment didn't work, we're going to sunset that, well, move on, sunk cost fallacy, or actually that's the beginnings of something really special and we can work on that. But we had to be much more responsive and so that we planned those stages in, but there was a kind of a bit of the seat of the pants quality to it that we were hoping that it paid off.
It's brilliant. That's a brilliant methodology and initiative, but it's great in the book how you describe how that evolved and how you had to calibrate the MRO.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely needed to evaluate it at the end of the day. At the end of that period, it needed evaluation. And some things have become things in their own right that have kind of become dominant in the project, and some things have kind of become smaller.
Yeah. Great for teaching too.
Yeah.
And I think that degree of agility in such a huge project, because you were working in that way of revisiting and questioning, is fantastic. But I wanted to talk a little bit then about something that you dealt with really thoughtfully throughout the project and also in the book, which is questions of credit and authorship, which loom very large in big interdisciplinary projects with people coming from different traditions. Emma, you mentioned that as a historian, you're used to writing on your own or perhaps with one other co-author. People coming from a data science or computer science background are used to having multiple authors on papers. There are all sorts of different kinds of outputs that you have to measure contributions and credit. And I know you experimented with some really interesting ideas around a film credit type approach to show what everyone was doing, taxonomies of roles and credit, particularly paying attention to early career researchers and what they needed to get from the project, and how sometimes that meant stepping back as principal investigators. So it would be really great to hear a little bit more about your ethos around credit and authorship. Ruth, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So at the outset of the project, we wrote a project charter which kind of addressed this. We were saying, be as generous as possible in the way that you credit your collaborators. And then we came to our first publication and we realised we actually needed to sit down and have a frank conversation about who was an author. And I think actually we defaulted to pretty much everyone who'd done any work being credited as an author, because we have all sorts of work going in. We have data acquisition, we have the wrangling of the data, we have annotating data, we have people designing the research question, we have people doing things that looks more like historical research, we have people designing new methodologies, and all of those things are part of the creation process, and we wanted a credit with authorship. So on that first publication, we had to have that hard conversation and come up with a set of steps to deciding who's an author. And then we also had that kind of fun film credit cover sheet that we, when we deposited the kind of copy in the archive, we put that on the cover, which kind of spelled out what everyone did using the credit taxonomy. So I think that was really helpful, but there are tensions there, right? We recognised that at the beginning of the project, it was really important to credit everyone across the project to kind of make clear all of those different kinds of labour across the data scientists and the historians and the librarians and etc. But we've also got the tension that we've got early career researchers, historians and digital humanities people who need to go on the job market. They need CVs that look competitive and readable to the kinds of people who will be hiring them. And so sometimes that means that historians will need some single author or two-person authored publications. So we needed to think about how we make sure that credit flows. So you cite earlier work, for example, where more people are listed. But it's a juggling act. I mean,
yeah, it's really hard because equally, I mean, it sounds wonderful to go for an inclusive approach, get lots of names on, but the more names that are on there, the more any individual's input can look slightly diminished, because it's very different having an author list of 2 or 3 and one of 10. So finding that balance so that the people who may have done more than others are fully credited, and it's the free rider problem, isn't it, as well in some ways? I mean, just as we were talking about before with how do you collaborate across disciplines, it's really hard. It's unbelievably hard meeting everybody's needs, listening to everybody's voices, reaching decisions that are fair for everybody, because people sometimes just want different things. And of all the things in the project, authorship was one of the, it's a bone of contention. It's a difficult one, and it's a flashpoint that comes back up over and over again when you're not quite expecting, and you think you've dealt with authorship, and then suddenly there's another issue where there is some disagreement. So it just takes a lot of really sensitive dealing with and care all the way through the project. And there really isn't. I mean, I guess it's kind of what you're saying about, but there isn't a simple takeaway. There's not an answer that we can have feedback and say, well, this is how you do it. It just needs to be thought about and factored into it, and sometimes it just takes time. And again, it's this intangible kind of overhead costs of these big collaborations, is that suddenly, instead of doing the work, you're talking about authorship, and it's part of a big collaboration.
And I think the problem is not necessarily with the collaboration, it's with the culture in which we're situated, that maybe we're ready to push norms really hard and say, actually, we want a book with 28 authors on the front. But actually, hiring departments are not in that place. And so we sort of need to balance the world that we live in. And so we want to press norms, but we also want to deliver things that get research in under the radar, so that people will start reading things that they think they might not want to read digital research, but kind of get it under the radar because it looks like a traditional output. And also, we just didn't want to make big experiments on people's futures. So you can push an agenda that serves the project, and we can be like the stand-up project that does really radical things. But then early career researchers can become kind of collateral damage because you've experimented on their CV and actually they're unhireable. And we hope that we haven't done that, because actually everyone's kind of gone on and got hired now. So, but it was that kind of tension that we really wanted to make sure that actually we were willing to step back where necessary and say, actually, you have the credit because it's really important for you, and we're willing to kind of be the guinea pigs.
I think that care comes through very strongly in the way you've described it in the book about those issues, particularly for early career researchers. But it also connects on to the discussion that you have around one discipline not being in the service of another, and how that plays out in terms of equality and the radical collaboration that you're talking about. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you negotiated that and didn't have that service relationship in either direction, really.
I think that was a particular risk for people coming from the libraries and also people coming from research software engineering. I think there's often been this idea that research software engineers are this kind of service role, and we wanted to completely challenge that and say they're equal collaborators. And so, especially when we designed, for example, the minimum research outcomes, or the MVPs, the RSEs were absolutely central to designing those and making sure that there was a question that was interesting for their discipline. And I think because we're situated in the Turing, we really wanted to make sure that we were doing things that were interesting for the data science community. I think that's changed a little bit with the project. I think the RSEs who were in the project at the beginning are absolutely kind of central to the design of it. And some people have been parachuted in for the last couple of months. I think that's different, that it's a different dynamic at that point where, we're an evolving community, but absolutely, we just really wanted to say, actually, we can model what the future of the career of RSEs might look like in the UK. And I hope we've done that. Yeah.
I mean, it had to be a collaboration as well. I think it was actually very difficult to set up. And I think in some ways that was less of, taking the whole duration of the project, that's been less of a flashpoint over, less of a difficulty that we've been dealing with over the 5 years than many of the other things. Because we couldn't have done the project, nobody, no discipline or no bit of the project or no individuals could get on and do it without collaborating with others. So that of all the things that you might think would be very difficult, resolved, has been less of a, definitely, I think, have been less of a flashpoint, and has worked really, from my perspective, has worked really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, makes me think too the value of this kind of writing, because instead of coming out with standards and saying this is the way you should cite, or this is the way that RSE should work, you just say, well, this is the way that we did it. These are our values, these were the problems, this was the context, and this is what we did. And it allows, as that genre builds, that genre of writing, people will just be able to dip in and design something for themselves.
We hope people can improve on it. We hope people say, actually, we'll take that idea, that works, seems to work really nicely, and we'll modify it in this way. And hopefully there'll be like a swathe of things that come after that improve on those, because they were experiments. We did our best, and we tried to improve as we went, which is why we had living documents. So we were like, this is not working for us, let's do something else. But hopefully other people can say, and now I can improve on it even further. And we would love to be doing projects in a few years where we can say, actually, we can now look at MVP 2.0. we can develop on other people's practices.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So I've got a question, possibly a thorny question, about data and data access. So the project's always struck me as having a productive tension between the large amounts, very large for humanities, large amounts of data used for computational analysis, which is breaking new ground in a lot of ways, and problems with data access and data preparation. So my question to you, Emma, to start is, Do you think those are two sides of the same coin? So they're just inevitable, and perhaps the larger the data set, the larger the problems? And if that's the case, then it's something we just need to embrace. Or should projects only be funded after data access has been absolutely proven and we know that we're going to have seamless computational access to that data?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think, looking back over the problem, the things that have been very difficult and the things that have not been such a problem. I mean, I think that getting access to the data has been a real headache and has been we knew it would be difficult. We built in, or Ruth wisely built in, that we would have a rights administrator who would try and negotiate the right to this. So some people definitely knew that this was going to be difficult, but it was really very difficult. It's not about the size of the data, though, I mean, that is an issue. Bigger data is more difficult. But it's not entirely a size problem. It's about rights access. It's who owns the digital copies of the data that we want. So for us as a group of historians, the data is owned by our national bodies, things like the British Library and Public Record Office, TNA. So it's kind of owned, those original documents are in public ownership, but the digital copies tend to be in private ownership. And making those negotiations is very difficult. And of course, we are researchers. We don't come from the business world. We come from the academic world. It's not where our strengths and our skill sets lie. So negotiating, getting access to the data, reassuring them that you're going to keep the data safe and secure and that you're not upsetting their business model in some ways was a very large part of what we did for the first few years. I don't think one could say you have to have the data first, because how can anybody put that effort in? You have to be funded to put that effort in. But I think I would say it's a bit of a problem in the UK, and I think one could organise the ownership of the digital versions of a nation's heritage differently to the way we have ended up doing it in the UK. I would say anybody looking at how do we do this, I wouldn't look at the UK as a model. There are other models out there, and that's my takeaway, really.
I don't think the onus should be on individual projects. It is like a national scale problem. It's not about things being behind a paywall. Sometimes the owners of data, they give it to you really simply. Just send it over on a hard drive, and that's great. But the issue there is reproducibility. That we're kind of working in a field where we need to have reproducible results, and we can't share it on. We have to think about derived data sets. We need to think about samples in order to make our work reproducible, and also we need to do things like build safe havens in order to be able to safely analyse it. However, I do think we have the beginnings of solutions that we're developing. So we're developing infrastructures to do that on the project. What we need are funding to think more strategically about making that infrastructure available to the whole of the UK, so we don't keep doing the same thing over and over again. And there could be environments where we could safely put commercial data into it, where people could play with it and analyse it and get the results out at the end and not touch it. In a kind of Hattie trust model, there are ways that we could do that, but that needs a kind of national think. And it needs funding. So we're kind of turning that over not to individual project investigators, but to our funding bodies.
And, well, we can only hope that policymakers read the book. But, the other thing that springs to mind, of course, is that living with the machines was breaking new ground, and part of the investment was to surface these issues. So you're possibly in a purposefully more awkward position than future projects will be, because part of the goal of this project was to surface those issues. Yeah.
That's a lovely way of, I don't know if we knew that in the early years of the project, but that's a lovely way of putting it, that we've done the useful work by exploring that problem. And just to say, the book is short. Part of the reason we went for a short book is because we don't have answers to any of these things, or answers to any of your questions. We don't have lockdown answers, but we want to share our experiences, and we want there to be a debate around things like precisely this. We don't have the answer, but we just want to expose it, and it's short, and so people can just access it and engage with it.
Yeah, it's very accessible.
And I guess as well, once you've got the data, it's great, but you've also got a new set of challenges there. And you talk in the book about one of the recommendations being encouraging other projects to interrogate the contours of their data, particularly challenging when you're working at the scale that you were, but with any data set really, because you're often missing a lot of the contextual information. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the approaches that you took to that.
And we're really proud of that work on the project. So we call it the environmental scan, and we started with the newspapers. We've got millions and millions of pages of newspapers. It's one of the biggest, humanities data sets, but it's actually really partial, and we don't know the ways in which it's partial and the ways in which it's biased. So we did this piece of work where we digitised the newspaper press directories, which we saw as a kind of proxy for the universe of newspapers that did exist, and then did all of this kind of amazing technical stuff like cross-matching the titles, and then using the information about their political leanings and geographical reach to actually interrogate the biases that we have in the data available. What don't we have? And of what we do have, is it biased towards conservative voices, and how does that change over time? So we're now able to say that about that data set, and so I think that's a really important contribution, and I think similar things need to be happening for lots of other data sets to make clear their contours and how they're suitable for certain kinds of research and not suitable for other kinds, or how caution needs to be applied about the research that's being done with it, and the histories that are being written with partial records.
No, it's amazing work, and I think just both the results in relation to the newspapers, but also the method and the approach that you've demonstrated and now written about are going to be enormously valuable for other people. I sort of wanted to finish with a question about, because I'm a historian as well, so immediately drawn to that question. What do you think are some of the lessons from a project like this for doing digital history, or perhaps turning it the other way around, doing history digitally? And Emma, I wonder if we could start with you, because this was the first time that you had really been involved with something that used digital methods, and it would be great to hear your takeaways.
Yeah, that's really, it's a lovely question. So I had not done digital history before. My use of digital didn't go beyond Excel spreadsheets. It's not really digital at all. So I guess my big takeaway is that with there are some things you just can't do by traditional qualitative techniques that historians use. So the work that I've been doing most recently is on the census. There's just millions of entries. Historians cannot go through them one by one and pick out the things that are of interest to them. The only way you could use samples, and that's what people were doing, but the only way you can really analyse all of this is with computers. And the way I think of it really is that work really helps you see what's interesting. You can really start to see, you can sort that data, and you can really start to hone in on some interesting things like is it men or women doing the work? Is it young women or old people? What kind of households are people living in when they've got that job, as opposed to, so you can really start to identify things. The other thing that you can do is just use all of that and use your digital data to just go back to the original record. And you can now, instead of just having like millions and millions of entries and not knowing which one you want to look at, you can say, look, there are these groups of people who are behaving in this way. Why don't we just have a little look at the documents for those ones and look at the page? And then suddenly you can see all sorts of things that actually aren't so apparent in the tables that you've been seeing. So for me, it's really an additional tool. It's a way of it's certainly a way of working with data when you've got to a scale that's beyond what you can imagine. And of course, I'm a Victorian, I do the 19th century. As we move into the 20th century, there's going to be more and more examples of people with more data. So what it does is it helps you see what's interesting, and it helps you do some of that qualitative work that you're used to doing better. Basically, that's how I feel about it at this point.
I feel like my job is to kind of ventriloquize other people a little bit, because Mia and Giorgia aren't here, and also because it's a much bigger project, not just historians. I think from the British Library's perspective, they really wanted to experiment with someone using that kind of massive data set that they'd co-created with Find My Past, and so we were this like amazing test case for them. I think they've learned lots of lessons about like how people can access that, the kind of legal requirements of that, how they can kind of facilitate through their organisation in the future, perhaps through Jupyter notebooks in the reading room and all sorts of things like that. So that's given them lots of lessons of ways of moving forward. But from my perspective, it's really about like the facilitation of like the different parts of the project. I've just been this kind of broker trying to coordinate, the relationship between data scientists and historians, and it's just been the kind of an insight into the kind of systems you need to facilitate that. And I think in the future I'd go about that in different ways, or maybe I'd come to some of the solutions quicker. So for me, it's about that process of facilitation, of how do you set up collaboration, and how do you keep revisiting and feeding that in a positive way on a daily basis to make sure that everyone has what they need. And I think that's especially true as we're coming to the final weeks of our project, and still making sure that everyone has what they need to kind of finish right and move beyond the project with what they need to do the next phase of that research. So, yeah.
I was really struck, Emma, by what you were saying about sort of retrieving the humans in the data, and that ability on a project like this to move backwards and forwards between different scales and use different lenses to look at what you're doing, so that you don't lose sight of those human stories, and that the quantitative leads you to that.
Absolutely.
Those
it really
insights.
feels like you can kind of toggle between two completely different scales and frames. Yeah.
And I think that's been done enormously successfully in this project. So.
As you were talking, I was wondering that, as a follow-up to that, how do you think the textbook for historical methodology will change? Is there another chapter on digital history, or are these methods that you've surfaced, do they need to be woven through the whole textbook? Maybe.
Really interesting. I think historians are going to need a lot of skilling up. And I guess, again, comes back to the big national system. Lots of historians have given up maths at GCSE now, any kind of computing. They've gone down a very strongly humanities route. So, yeah, I don't know, but it's not going to be easy or straightforward. I would say
the first step is awareness that these things are now possible. So at least you can have the conversation and then work out where the extra training is.
Absolutely, and collaboration again. That's where collaboration comes in. Not every historian needs to do all of this, but maybe they would be interested in working with somebody who does do this, but would like help thinking about the questions and is not so confident looking at the original documents. And so I think collaboration is really the key.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah. we do have Giorgia available as well, who could answer some of the questions.
Yes.
If we want to open up the roundtable to her as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Good.
It was really about having those conversations, and you've been part of this. Obviously, would have loved to have even more funding, but it's a well-resourced project, and you've had, incredible expertise and been able to work with the British Library. But I wondered about libraries generally as the places to go to have these conversations as humanities researchers, and I wonder if you've got any thoughts about that.
I can start, and I'd be really interested to know if Giorgia wants to chime in, but I think working with curators and other people working in libraries, you understand so much better what is possible with their collections, what needs to happen before their collections are usable, actually. So we've digitised new material on the project in collaboration with the British Library. Then we're like, we can't use it yet until so for example, digitise new maps. We need to then geolocate every corner so that they're usable for the tasks we need. So I think that's really important. They have the best sense of what data is absolutely untapped as well. So things like the newspaper press directories, these things that people have been wanting to work on for ages, like working with Mia and Maya and Giorgia and all of the other colleagues at the British Library, they could help us identify those opportunities for approaching the data in a different way. I think that was really, really important. Giorgia, do you have anything you wanted to add there?
Hi everyone. I'm sorry not to be there tonight. Unfortunately, I had some health issues. Well, the only thing I can add to what Ruth has just said is that digital and methods are important, but we always have to consider what is the state of source. And as you mentioned, with maps, in order to make them usable, we need to georeference them, and that is a technical thing. But in the case of newspapers, for example, it is important to know what is the state of conservation, for example, and how this affect the timeline of digitization, the cost of digitizations, and many other things. So we can't disregard where all this material is is preserved and held. So all these things that sometimes are given for kind of granted are, as we discussed and explain in the book, make a big difference, and they can affect the process quite a lot in many ways. And it was interesting because we tried to find ways to use technical skills to somehow answer some and solve some of these problems. We've created a tool called the press picker that helped us selecting the newspapers, considering the physical status and the level of conservation of these sources. So there's a lot to that, and I think it is really important to consider where everything is stored, like physically. So the physical space is absolutely important in libraries in this case.
I think leading on from what Giorgia said, it made me think about how when we create digital assets, we turn them into this kind of remixable form, because they're like all of these like little units, like articles in a newspaper or letters in an archive. And what we do when we apply digital methods to them, we sometimes decontextualize them from all of that kind of contextual knowledge of the creation of the archive. And actually working closely with archivists and librarians allows us to kind of keep that contextual information in mind and thinking about how it is always informing the results that we can get from those kinds of approaches.
So from the advisory board. Yeah. So Jane and I were on the advisory board. It was a different experience, I thought. I don't know what you thought, Jane, but it was a reasonably large advisory board, as it should have been for the scale of the project. But you extended radical collaboration to the advisory board as well. So we actually felt included and invited into events. Jane, I don't know if you've got any comments on that as well, but I'd be interested to hear from Ruth afterwards on how effective you found that, and whether you'd change anything around the advisory board, whether you think you could have been more radical, or where it helped and where it didn't, perhaps.
No, I agree. It was a very different experience to other advisory boards I've been on, where often it's about reporting on the wonderful work that's already happened, and there isn't that opportunity to feed in to the next stage of work and to feel that you're actually contributing and being part of that conversation and collaboration, and that was fantastic. And it felt like a proper day of work, and that was great. And I learned lots of new things as well. So there was that lovely exchange of knowledge going on. So it was a really rewarding experience.
That's really nice to hear, because we, just so that people know, we have 2 advisory board meetings a year, but one of them we make sure is a workshop with the entire team, so we can showcase what work we're doing, but also get feedback on things that are in progress. And that's been really valuable to us. We've had loads of pointers that have really kind of nudged us in directions, such as the nudge to write this book, but also, where people might be in different domains that might be interested in our approaches, and to really kind of capitalise on all of the additional expertise we've got around us. And we nominated our advisory board, sort of everyone on the investigator team. They kind of nominated people that would keep them honest, right? Who do I want that's going to kind of actually inform me in ways that will keep pushing me to do the best I can in that area?
I think it's been a much more active advisory board than ones often it's a very passive role, and the project's smaller and it doesn't really need that degree of oversight. It was such a large project. I think actually it was really important to have a really meaningful advisory board who could keep an eye on you and steer you and be very helpful as well. But I mean, given the size of the project, I think you really do need some kind of external eyes on what you're doing. And it's been, it was there from day one, extremely valuable to us. But although we're not really in the business of providing kind of moral guidance for other people doing digital history, I do think in a really big project, a properly engaged advisory board is a necessity, actually. Yeah.
Okay. The discussion has been about ways of working, but we've not really heard much about outputs and outcomes, which I know isn't really the focus of the book, but is clearly underpins a lot of what you're doing. Have there been breakthrough findings? Is there new knowledge and understanding? And particularly relevant, I think, have some forms of collaboration been more effective or had more lasting results than others? And just the discussion has been positive, but are there negatives? Which and we talked about honesty, so it'd be great to hear about that.
I think it's been really hard so I think we have been collaborative from the start, and the historians have been part of the designing the research questions, helping co-design the methodologies that best serve the research questions. But the point at which we have data that is analysable and we have results has, as you might expect, come quite late in the project. So that's been challenging because, you know, we basically get to the last year of the project and we have all of this material, and we could do another 5 years with the kinds of findings we've got. If you'd like to give us more money, by the way, we would be delighted to write many books on this. And so that's been a hard challenge. It's been great because it feels like we have loads of material, but so those kind of breakthrough findings are only just coming now. So the work where we've kind of linked information on rail tracks and the census, which is like an amazing feat of like data linking across 3 data types, allows us to say things about what kinds of families are living near rail. Are there many people living in one room, or can they afford servants? So we can say very textured things that kind of really speak to the complexity of the impact on people's everyday lives. But they're coming now. So yeah, we have like these swathes of material, and we have a book that we're working on that will come out after the project, but is in draft now.
I mean, I think that's quite common that projects come to an end and outputs, or certainly humanities projects, is very usual that they filter out in the time afterwards. But I mean, it is totally the case that we're in year 5, we have an absolute abundance of riches, and that the clock is ticking. So, and I don't think, you know, I mean, obviously we're here to celebrate a book, but I think, you know, I think we have been clear on some of the things that don't work. I mean, just the sheer difficulties of getting the data, the problem of dealing with private companies rather than with research institutes, the difficulties of collaborating across really large teams, of just communicating and keeping in touch, disagreements over authorship. I mean, I think we do have quite a lot to say. Maybe we're saying it quite cheerfully, but I think we have identified quite a few things that have genuinely been really quite challenging for us.
There are some problems with infrastructure as well, of course.
Oh yeah, we had to create a safe haven, right? So it became kind of best practice at the Turing to keep data that's commercially sensitive in a data safe haven. But at the point where that was recommended to us, it wasn't built. And so we actually had a team member who was kind of pulled from the project to start building it, and that was at the beginning of COVID. So we've actually contributed to a really important kind of infrastructural development at the Turing, which I think is really important. But I think where we've produced a wealth of things on new pipelines, new methods, new tools, new software, exciting methodologies that I think are really kind of full of like latent possibilities. So we're absolutely kind of abundant there. Those historical findings are emerging now.
But the infrastructure needs to be turned off as well, doesn't it?
Infrastructure needs to be turned off. So this is where we're talking with the funding agency, but we're also kind of making recommendations in white papers about actually what does a national infrastructure look like, and not just in terms of kind of a built infrastructure and the modules of data and tools, but also the human infrastructure of what does it mean for knowledge to pass between projects in a way that you don't lose knowledge. And that's is making sure that kind of investigators move around. But I think the crucial people, again, the research software engineers, that really important kind of problem-solving knowledge, they're the people who can really take it from project to project and make sure that we're not like building the same infrastructure over and over again, building the same solutions, but actually capitalising on the last one and taking ground.
And you want continuity with the minimum infrastructure, don't you? I mean,
Precisely.
You can't keep it all live, but yeah. So this next question is sort of related to that, to the people side of things. Given the perspective you gave on collaborative historical practice, does the project provided any insights into how best to train the new generation of historians that could conduct research in this way? So Emma, maybe.
I would say no. At the moment, we've not ended up in a position to advise on how you would train the new generation of historians, quite honestly. We've had postdocs who've joined the project who've been historians who have obviously always had a technical bent and have been trying to get hold of data and working on data in bigger scales, and have learned coding and have learnt as part of their PhDs. So there are people out there that are already doing that. There is a growth of kind of digital history and digital humanities in history departments. So I think we will see more of that coming through. I mean, realistically, being such a humanities discipline, I think most historians are not going to. It's not going to become an ordinary part of a PhD programme. It's such specialist skills. But I suppose the takeaway is that we need to carve out a space inside our discipline where, I think it's kind of connected as well to bigger questions about economic history, because a lot of this really grows up through economic history. Economic history has kind of struggled to hold its place in many departments. There's some strong corners, but that used to be something that every department had somebody doing economic history, and that's something that's declined. And we really need that space filled. I think that space is really going to be filled with something that we might today call digital history. I think there's a lot of work and a lot of thinking to do about that, really. And I mean, I hope it would be lovely if that's one of the legacies of the project, that we can really showcase in some of the historical outputs, we can really showcase the synergies and the fact that you just end up with something that's much bigger than the sum of the parts. When you bring the digital techniques together and the traditional historical analysis, you bring them together, you just get something that is different and really moves our understanding forward in really interesting ways. But I think there's going to be quite a lot of work for our discipline to do to think about how we, how we realise that over the next generation. And again, takes us back out of the responsibility of individual projects and much more into the national situation. And I think, again, that's part of the point of the project, really, is what big lessons can we learn for how we want our disciplines and our universities to operate.
I think what we have done, in addition to that, is we've produced lots of tutorials around the things, but I mean, they're much bespoke. It's not like a programme that every historian must go through, but we have produced sort of programming historian tutorials on computer vision. And with the tools we're developing, we've started doing workshops on them, and we're producing kind of teaching materials around them. But it's very much kind of tailored to the outputs of the project. But I think there might be a kind of future version where we think about actually, what would this look like as a set of skills that we could train people at? So where we have made contributions is with the Turing summer school that they did for PhD students who are thinking of moving into an RSE career, at the Oxford summer school, where people can learn DH skills. So I think we're really kind of pushing into those spaces for people who are already self-identifying that they want to learn more. We'd love to kind of feed into more of those kinds of summer schools, winter schools, and go on tour doing workshops as part of other people's MPhil programs. So I think that's where we're making a contribution at the moment, and where I think we can push a bit more.
It's fascinating though, isn't it? Because I'm a historian by trade as well, and it feels like we've been having these conversations about how do you naturalise digital methods in history as a discipline for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it says something about it. It almost seems like we're always working beyond the cutting edge, and so it doesn't quite trickle down in the right way. But also, I mean, there are lots of artefacts that your project's leaving that would be great for teaching and pedagogy.
Yeah. And I wonder also, and this speaks to the core theme of the book, is whether training in interdisciplinary collaboration and how to develop a collaborative mindset, because you said that it's hard. There's an assumption that everyone can do it, but it's hard. But you've sort of set out a path for people not necessarily to become digital historians, but to find ways to produce digital history through collaboration. That might be one of the real takeaways from it.
I hope so. And because I think scientists kind of have this model in the lab that they're already working collaboratively. They're not working necessarily interdisciplinarily, but they're working collaboratively already. And we're kind of doing something a bit higher, that we're trying to work collaboratively and interdisciplinarily. But yeah, we just need more models in our discipline, because there are few.
So that's a good segue into perhaps the last question. So we've got a data scientist in the audience who's really interested in medieval and ancient history, which is great. How would you suggest that they could find historians who would be receptive to considering working together? And the last phrase is the kicker. I often find historians think I'm a bit odd for discussing these types of methods. You think we're beyond that?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it is an issue that we are naturally in some ways conservatively inclined, and we like to read the document. We like to go to archives, and sympathise with that. All I can do is put on a completely different hat at this point and say, as you introduced me as the president of the Royal Historical Society, one of the things I think that in that role, and I see here as well, is that so many of us want in academia is to communicate and to find other people who've got the same interest. We're stuck in our own place, we're physically in a particular department, we know our people, and we just want to find more people with interests like ours. It's really difficult because digital technology does allow us to connect over social media. It's just that us as kind of scholarly historians haven't really found a way of networking and connecting. So we're actually really interested in finding some answers to that. They're not particularly relevant to this question, but I think in some ways it does speak to the themes of what we're talking about, is that so that you can collaborate. If you can But before you collaborate, you need to find the people that you're going to collaborate with. And it's very difficult in a lone scholar discipline such as history. That is difficult. Even sometimes inside a university, there'll be somebody over in your economics or your business department or who knows where, or you do food history, there's somebody in biology, who knows? Fantastic people to collaborate with, but you're such a big institution, you don't know who they are. So I think there's a kind of different set of questions there, and if we can find ways of connecting, and I know wearing another hat, that is something I'm very interested in doing, maybe that's a way forward. But I don't know if our project has come up with an answer to that question. Ruth, what do you think?
No, I mean, I think universities would love it if they could set these up. I think you do need these institutions to say, if there's an institute of, we've got the Digital Environment Research Institute at Queen Mary, so they try and do sandbox events. They try and get people from different disciplines together in a room, kind of solving problems together. But otherwise, I guess if you're a data scientist, just turn up to some history seminars and make some friends. But that's how it starts. Often it's slow over coffee, a conversation that you have over 6 months. That turns into a research idea. That's been my experience where it's grown up more organically.
I think that's good advice.
I think it was flagged in the chat, but the digital history seminar that the Institute of Historical Research runs might be a good starting place to find digitally inclined historians as well.
So there's a couple more questions. We've got time for...
Where are we?
6 o'clock.
We're at
Just
6
gone
o'clock
thick.
now.
Let's have one last one.
Have one last one. Okay, so this might have been the first one that came through actually. What is your view of digital tools provided by commercial providers, usually using their expensive content? So without naming names, I expect, we know of these platforms, I mean, that they're powerful, and there's lots of potential for, I'm all for heterogeneity. So I think they're definitely a legitimate part of the landscape, aren't they? But how does that compare to the, using Python and Jupyter notebooks?
I mean, let's just compare it to using general off-the-shelf tools. It's easier to get a hold of. It's easier to teach in the classroom if your university subscribes. So that's the barrier. But let's pretend you're part of a wealthy university. Then maybe it's a really good entry point to get a taste of whether it's doing something for you. Does it answer some of the questions that I have? And then it might help you say, actually, I'm interested in, natural language processing. I'm interested in gaining more of those skills. I think it helps you identify which skills you might want to obtain, or whether you want to obtain a collaborator, because that's the nature of the book. But I think they're a useful entry point, but they're exclusionary because they are only for wealthy universities that can afford to subscribe. So there's two sides there. But off-the-shelf tools, we're not snobs. You can get a certain mileage down the road with those, and to work out if the data is suitable, to work out if the rough methodology is suitable before you start developing bespoke things and learning entirely new programming languages.
But once again, it's really about access to the content, the data that you're paying for.
And we didn't talk about this today, but is it ready for analysis? What we've spent a lot of time is not just acquiring the data, but then getting it research ready, wrangling it into a shape or a database form, or cleaning it. I personally have spent a whole year cleaning a data set before. So yes, but it's going to probably be, you need to get access to the under the hood data probably to know if it's actually clean enough for your purposes. So yes, as an entry point.
I mean, it's like when you, you get a book from the library and it kind of has some extracts from the census or whatever it is. And this is really interesting and it teaches you what you could find. But at some point, as you go further with your research questions, you want to go down to the called Offtheshelf, and see the whole thing and just see what's there, make it. And I guess this is very similar, that it's an entry point to research methods, but I guess that's the point of pure research. Pure research is about kind of really going back to the thing that's there, whatever the discipline is really trying to go deep. So this is just, it just operates in exactly the same way here, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Well, great conversation and a wonderful book. We encourage everyone to go out and read it and share it with policymakers in particular.
And it is open access, we should say, so
open
anyone can go out and read it.
So wonderful, and thanks to the audience. I'm sure Ruth and Emma would like to hear from you if you've got follow-up questions, would like to make contact. And thank you to my co-host, Jane.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.